Hey guys, Chris Fix here, and today I'm going to show you how to replace a radiator in your car or in your truck. And I'm going to go into detail and show you all the tips and tricks to make this job super simple. And at the end of the video, after you're done watching, you too will be able to replace your radiator at home and save yourself a ton of money. Now we'll be replacing the radiator on my truck, and this is actually a really good example of a radiator replacement. This is one of the more difficult ones because we have an automatic transmission and we have transmission cooler lines going into this radiator. If you have a manual transmission, you probably won't have that. Also, it is pretty tight in here, so we will be working in a tight area, but even though it is a little bit more difficult, it's still really simple to do this, as you will find out in a few minutes. Now, the reason why we're replacing the radiator in my truck is because once you start her up, you can see right away there's a crack in the radiator that's causing the coolant to shoot out and make that belt squeal loud. And one of the main reasons why your radiator might fail like this is because the coolant was never changed, or it wasn't changed at the proper interval. In this case, it's supposed to be changed every 3 to 5 years, but right away, if you look at this radiator cap, that doesn't look good. There's sludge, there's rust, and this whole system is rusted up. That's because the previous owner never changed the coolant. I was actually the first person to change the coolant in this truck and try to do a complete flush, and it did help it last longer, but eventually that radiator did leak. But that's okay, because we have a brand new one, and here are all the tools and products you need to replace a radiator. We're gonna keep it real simple. We're using all common hand tools. We have a flare nut wrench set, you need a pliers, you need a ratchet, some sockets and extensions, and then a spill-proof funnel is super helpful when we go add our new coolant to the new radiator. And product-wise, we have a brand new high-quality radiator with a good warranty, but that's not all I'm going to install. Since we have everything apart, it's a good idea for extra reliability. Replace your lower radiator hose, your upper radiator hose, your thermostat, and your radiator cap. It's only a couple extra bucks more, and it gives you that reliability. You're also going to need some 50-50 antifreeze. You could do straight antifreeze and mix it with distilled water, and we're going to need a little bit of transmission fluid. Make sure you choose the right type for your vehicle, because we're going to be removing the transmission cooler lines. Now, I do want to thank Advanced Auto Parts for helping support the video, get me all these products so I could show you guys how to install a radiator in your vehicle. So thank you very much, and with that said, let's get started. And there's one thing I want to show you real quick that's super important. You might be tempted to use one of these radiator sealers that are easy to use, and they're also very inexpensive, but I highly recommend that you avoid using sealers like these unless if it's a complete emergency. How this works is you take the radiator cap off and you would add this directly to your coolant. The problem is that this stuff will clog the leak, but it could also clog the passageways in your radiator or even heater core. And just to give you a real life example, the previous owner of my Del Sol used a radiator sealer and a head gasket sealer, and here's what it looks like inside. Pry this open with a screwdriver. If we take a look, okay, under here you can see that copper area right there. That's the head gasket sealer, and there's all this like gummy, sludgy stuff here. That is a radiator sealer. And if we take a look at the top of the radiator, all these slots are what allow the coolant to flow through the radiator and then into the engine and cool the engine. So it's important that these slots stay clog free. But you can see that sealer actually clogged up a couple of these slots. So while this stuff can work and it can seal your leaks, I highly recommend that you don't use it unless if it's an emergency, and instead get yourself a replacement radiator to install, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now, so let's get started. Now, the first step to do, before we start draining any coolant, before we start taking the old radiator out, the first thing you want to do, very important, is make sure you flush your cooling system. Now, I already did a video on how to super flush your cooling system, where we went from this really dark, sludgy coolant, and we flushed it out multiple times until we completely cleaned the cooling system. And I'll be sure to link this video in the description below so you can easily find it. It's important that you flush out the entire cooling system, get rid of all that dirty, contaminated coolant before you install your nice new radiator. It'd be a shame to install the radiator and then run that dirty coolant through it, which kind of defeats the purpose. Once your cooling system is completely flushed like it is on my truck, the next thing to do is drain the coolant. But before we touch anything, make sure your engine is cold. You don't want to open up a radiator cap with a hot engine, because scalding coolant could come flying out, and that wouldn't be good. So now we're going to open up this radiator cap with a cold engine, and we're going to go under the vehicle to drain the coolant. Now you're going to find your coolant drain plug at one of the bottom corners of your radiator, like this right here. If you don't have a coolant drain plug, then you could remove your lower radiator hose and let it drain from there. But in this case, we have a drain plug, so I'm going to loosen it up, and we're going to let the coolant drain into a bucket. Now, as we let that drain, we could do some stuff up here at the top by the engine bay. And the first thing we need to do is remove the negative cable on the battery. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would you do that? We're just removing the radiator. And the answer actually makes a lot of sense. There are airbag sensors that are typically right next to the radiator in the front for a front collision. If you're removing your radiator and you hit one of those sensors by mistake, you could cause the airbag to go off. And just to be safe, it's not worth the risk. All you need to do is remove the negative cable on the battery. And with that removed, now we could start removing our radiator. And since it's pretty tight up here, to make it easier, I'm gonna remove our air intake to give us a lot more access. So first, let's unscrew the hose clamp holding the intake to the throttle body, and then slip the hose right off. Good. Now we can remove the mass airflow sensor wiring harness and unclip the intake hose from the airbox. And check this out. This is what you get for letting your truck sit for 2 weeks. It looks like we had a chipmunk or something leave his food inside our airbox. And that's why your intake has a filter. So sorry, Mr. Chipmunk, you're gonna have to find a new place to store your nuts. And with all that cleaned out, now we can focus on removing our radiator. And it's really simple. All we have to do is remove our upper and lower radiator hoses. On the other side, we have 2 transmission cooler lines coming in we need to remove. Then we have the fan shroud, and we unbolt the radiator, and it'll come right out. So let's first focus on removing the upper radiator hose. So grab your pliers and clamp down onto the hose clamp and slide it off the end of the hose. Now the hardest part for removing a hose is pulling the hose off. Usually it's stuck on the end here, but a trick that works really well: twist the hose. Twist it so it breaks free, and once the hose is twisted, give it a wiggle, and it should come off just like that. So we got the upper radiator hose off. Now let's get the lower radiator hose off. So this is the same process. Use your pliers, clamp down on that hose clamp, and slide it out of the way. And as you can see, this hose is really stuck on here. And this is where that twist trick comes in handy. I'm gonna use my pliers and just twist the hose back and forth to loosen it up. And now it should slide right off. Beautiful. And with that lower radiator hose disconnected, let's move to the top of the engine bay and disconnect our transmission cooler lines. We have one up here and we have one down there. Now to disconnect these, try not to use a regular open-ended wrench. The problem is there's only 2 contact points for the flare nut, so if you loosen it, you could strip the flare nut. So instead, use one of these flare nut wrenches. You can see it has more sides, so there's more contact. That way you won't strip the flare nut. Now it's very important that you pay attention here. As you loosen this flare nut, make sure this line isn't twisting as well. This line shouldn't move. Sometimes what happens is the flare nut and the line here get stuck together, and as you loosen the flare nut, this line will twist and you could break it that way. If that does happen, just use some heat or penetrating fluid and that'll help separate the two. Good, the flare nut is spinning but the line is stationary, just what we want. And before we loosen it all the way, I'm gonna get a paper towel under here because this might leak out some fluid. So just hand loosen it the rest of the way till the flare nut comes off. And now we're gonna just pull this out. And look at that, we didn't even make a mess. It's not even leaking. So with the top transmission cooler line removed, now we could go down and remove the bottom one. And it's a little tight down here. There we go. And it looks like the whole fitting is spinning with the flare nut, which is another problem you could run into. Luckily, all you need is a big wrench to hold the fitting in place as you loosen up the nut. Just like that. Good. So with both transmission cooler lines removed, now we need to remove the fan shroud. And we'll do that by removing 2 bolts, starting with this bolt right here. So just loosen it up with your ratchet, just like that. Now head over to the other side of the fan shroud, and we'll loosen the second bolt, which is the last one holding the shroud in place. Good. Now we can pull the shroud up and rest it on the cooling fan. And now there's only 2 bolts holding our radiator in. We have 1 bolt on this side, and 1 bolt on the exact opposite side. And then at the bottom here, this radiator is only held in by a bracket. So once we unbolt it, we could just lift it up off the bracket. So let's go and unscrew this bolt right here. And it's nice that all these bolts are the same size, so we don't have to waste time changing sockets. Good. Now go back to the other side, and this is the last bolt holding the radiator in. And one last thing we need to do is just disconnect this line that goes to the coolant overflow tank. Now our radiator is ready to come out. All you have to do is give it a little wiggle and pull it up, and it should come right out, just like that. Beautiful. Now I'm gonna set this on the floor right here, and with the radiator removed, there's enough clearance to remove the fan shroud. Good, and I'll keep that down here as well. And now we can install our brand new radiator. Now before we do that, I always like to do preventative maintenance. There's a couple things on this truck that I need to do, and now's the perfect time because look at all this space here without a radiator. There's plenty of room. So what I'm gonna be doing is I'm gonna be installing a brand new belt tensioner because my belt squeaks when it gets wet and I know the tensioner is causing a misalignment. And I'm gonna be installing a brand new water pump. It's the perfect pair for installing your brand new radiator. I'm gonna do that real quick right now. So first we need to remove the serpentine belt, then remove the engine fan, remove the idler pulley, and the belt tensioner assembly, and the whole power steering assembly has to be unbolted and moved out of the way, as well as the air conditioner compressor. Then we could finally get to the water pump, and it's out with the old water pump, then clean the gasket surface, and in with the new water pump and gasket. Now everything has to go back together, starting with the power steering pump assembly, and then the AC compressor, then a brand new belt tensioner assembly, then an idler pulley, an engine fan, and finally put the belt back on. Now with that preventative maintenance done, let's get back to installing our brand new radiator. And what we're gonna do next is we're gonna go and install our upper and lower radiator hoses as well as our thermostat. So let's start with our upper radiator hose, which is this right here, and it connects right down there to our thermostat housing. So just like before, remove the clamp and move it to the top of the hose. Then twist the hose to break it free and pull it up and off. Now the thermostat housing is held in by 2 bolts, so remove both of those. That's 1, and that's 2. Then remove the housing, and finally, the old thermostat. Now we need to remove the gasket, so shove a towel in the hole so we don't get any debris in there, and then use a plastic scraper to scrape the old gasket off. Good. And finish it off with an abrasive sponge to get it nice and clean. Beautiful. With the surface cleaned and smooth, we are ready to install the new thermostat. But first, what I like to do is drill a small hole in the thermostat to allow the air to bleed out without the thermostat having to be open. So first, center punch it, and then use a 1/16 inch or smaller drill bit to make a hole. Just like that, perfect. And this is a little trick that's super helpful. It's gonna make bleeding the air out of your cooling system when we add the new coolant very easy, and you won't overheat, you won't get any hot spots. And the hole is small enough, it allows air through, but very little coolant through, so our thermostat could still function as it should. So now with that drilled, let's go install it. So first, put the gasket down, and then we're gonna install the thermostat. You want the spring of the thermostat down into the engine, so that's gonna be sitting right there like that. Then put the thermostat housing on, hand tighten the bolts, and then torque them down to 10 foot-pounds. Good. Now we can install our brand new radiator hose. Remember to get your old clips off your old hose. You could reuse these as long as they're not rusty or bent, but instead of reusing this clip, because these are a pain to get off sometimes, I'm gonna use a stainless steel hose clamp instead. So push the hose down onto the thermostat housing, and make sure you push it all the way down to the base of the housing right there. And then we could easily tighten down the hose clamp with a nut driver. Make sure it's not coming off, and good, let's do the same thing for the lower radiator hose. Remove the clamp with the pliers and pull the hose off the fitting. Good, now we need to get the top part off, which is right up here. And this is why I prefer the stainless steel hose clamps rather than these stock ones, because these are sometimes difficult to remove, especially in tight places. With all the clamps removed, this should come right off. Out with the old hose and in with the new. Finally, tighten down the hose clamp here and up here. So with our hoses installed, now we could go and install our brand new radiator. But first, you want to make sure that you take everything off the old radiator and transplant it onto the new one. In this case, it's very simple. We just have this one shroud right up here that we're going to take off and we're going to put on here. But on some cars, it's a little bit more than that. You might have an electric fan like this, and then there's 4 bolts that are holding in the electric fan. When you unscrew those bolts, this whole assembly will come out, and then you could transplant that onto the new radiator. So with our radiator all set up and ready to go, let's get our fan shroud in first. And then now we could go and install our radiator. Be cautious with the new radiator because the little aluminum fins are easy to bend and damage. So carefully get it in place, plug in the hose that goes to the coolant overflow tank, mount the fan shroud against the radiator, and bolt it in so that it's snug. Since we're here, we might as well tighten down the bolt to hold the radiator in as well. And we also have the transmission cooler lines to install, so make sure you hand tighten the flare nuts first so you don't cross thread them, and then snug them down with a wrench. And do the same exact thing for the bottom cooler line. Since we're down here, let's attach the lower radiator hose and tighten the hose clamp. Good. Now on the other side of the radiator, let's tighten down the bolt holding in the fan shroud and the bolt holding in the radiator so the radiator is completely bolted in. Then attach the upper radiator hose and tighten the clamp down. Finally get the air filter in, followed by the intake tubing, and tighten down the clamp securing it to the throttle body. Also, don't forget to reconnect and tighten the negative cable on the battery. Now we can fill up the radiator with coolant. So attach the adapter that fits on your radiator and push the no spill funnel in. Alright, with our funnel in place, now we need to add our coolant. And always check your owner's manual and make sure you're adding the correct type of coolant. In this case, we definitely want a 50-50 mix, and I'm going to be using a universal green coolant. Now we have 2 options. Right here we have a pre-mixed 50-50 antifreeze water mix, or we have our concentrate where we have to add our water to get that 50-50 ratio. This is nice for convenience, but it is more expensive, and this is cheaper, but you do have to mix it with your own water. And if you are mixing it with your own water, make sure you get distilled water without any minerals added. It has to be completely pure water. Any minerals will allow electrolysis in your cooling system, and that wouldn't be good. That eats away all the metals. So in this case, I'm going to be using the premix for convenience. So fill the radiator and cooling system up. In this truck, my owner's manual says the cooling system should take 9.5 quarts of coolant. And as the funnel empties, just add more coolant. So now that our coolant isn't going down anymore, let's go inside the truck and start her up. And with the truck running, we're gonna go over to the climate controls. We're gonna turn the heat on, make sure it's on all the way, and that's gonna allow the coolant to circulate through the heater core so we can get all the air bled out. Now on your dashboard, the one thing you wanna pay attention to is right here, your temperature gauge. You just want to keep an eye on your temperature gauge here and make sure it doesn't go up to the hot. It should stabilize right around half. If it goes up to hot, you either don't have enough coolant or there's air in the system. So every once in a while, just come back and check on this. And as we let the engine run, we have a couple of things we want to check in the engine bay. First thing, you want to make sure that you keep your funnel filled with coolant all the time. What's happening is the water pump is spinning, it's sucking coolant in and hopefully forcing the air bubbles out. Since this is the tallest point in the cooling system, the air bubbles are gonna come up and out of the cooling system through the funnel. And I just wanna show you something real quick. On some cars, you might have a bleeder valve built into the cooling system. Like in this case here, all you have to do is fill the cooling system and then crack your bleeder valve just like that. Make sure the coolant comes out with no bubbles and then close it. When the coolant comes out with no bubbles, that means you have bled the system, and that just gives you another easy way to help you get all the air out of the cooling system. We also want to make sure that we check all the connections and fittings that we undid to make sure there's no leaks. So I'm going to make sure every hose that we replaced, every connection that we removed, there are no leaks at all. So just give that a quick inspection. So far so good. One of the easiest ways to check for a leak is just to go under the vehicle and look for anything dripping. And I don't see anything here. So as we let the engine run, another thing that we want to do is check our transmission fluid, since we did lose some in the old radiator. And as expected, we're low on fluid. It should be filled up to here. So get a funnel and be sure to use the proper transmission fluid specified in your owner's manual. I'm down about a quart, so I'm going to be using this whole container. So let's remove the funnel and let's see what we got. Perfect. Now you can see this is filled to the proper level. So with our transmission topped off and completely full, that is done. And I'm taking a look at this coolant level here, and this hasn't gone down, so that means this is full and all the air is bled out. Now we can push the stopper in the funnel and remove it. We also need to remove the adapters and install our radiator cap. But we're not going to reuse the old one, and instead we're going to put in a nice new one. And you always want to check. The old one is a 16 PSI cap, and the new one is 16 as well. Good, so now we know we have the proper cap for our system. And with our radiator cap installed, the last thing that we need to do is come over to the coolant reservoir and top this off. We don't want to fill this all the way, just to the hot fill line, since the engine is warm. Beautiful, and we are completely done. Now that is how you replace your radiator. We went from this old leaking radiator that didn't cool very well, plus some old parts like the water pump, the hoses, and we installed a brand new CarQuest radiator with a lifetime warranty. One last thing, you want to make sure that you put your old dirty coolant in a sealed container so animals like your dog don't drink it, because it does taste sweet and it is poisonous. And you could recycle coolant at your local Advanced Auto Parts store, a mechanic shop, or your town's recycle center. So there you go. Make sure you recycle your coolant, and that is how you replace a radiator in your car or truck. It is that simple. Hopefully all the tips and tricks were helpful. If it was, remember to give the video a thumbs up. Also, if you're not a subscriber, consider hitting that subscribe button for more videos just like this. And as always, all the tools and products are linked in the description. One more quick tip. You want to make sure that you have hot heat. If you don't have hot heat coming out, that means you have air in your system. You also want to go for a shakedown ride, make sure your car isn't running hot and everything is performing properly. So I'm going to go do that right now.